Hi, my name's Daniel Weinchenker. Thanks for having me participate. I'm sorry I can't be there live in person. Um, and my background is that I work for Story Center, which is a nonprofit organization that's been focusing on individual and community storytelling initiatives almost for the past 25, almost 30 years. And so we do work almost exclusively in groups, and it's all first-person storytelling, people telling stories from their lives, often stories that maybe they don't understand, or maybe that they don't even know at the time at which they're telling them, if one ever knows their own stories really well. I think we find that every time you tell a story, even one that you feel like you know deeply, that every time you tell it, and neuroscience has proven this to be the case as well, is that it's new every single time. And you tell it in a different way because your lived experience is different. And so it goes. Um, so I was asked to share a little bit about those group storytelling work that we do that often involves story circles and how we hold those. And I just want to talk a little bit about um, a shift that we made in our work. We were almost doing exclusive in-person work. So in these group workshops, people would gather in an actual circle and share their ideas for where they were in their story, or where they weren't, and get feedback on those from people in the group. One shift that I would make was, instead of people jumping in to say, here's what I think, or here's what I think you should do, and all that stuff, was to reframe that. That was the workshop model that I kind of grew up with, and especially participated in graduate school when I was in school for writing at the time. That kind of workshop model, I enjoyed turning that on its head, which was that the person that was presenting the work or the story or the ideas for the story, I task them, I suppose, with asking questions to the group. That there are things that you want to know maybe about your own story, or about how it came across to people, or what they're interested in that you would like to know, which requires you to be aware of your own story and your own feelings about it. So it does put the onus on the storyteller to get the kind of feedback that they're looking for. You can also opt to just say, I'm open to whatever it is you want to say, and in which case we have a lot of ground rules for how to give constructive feedback to people. But what I wanted to focus more on in this short little session was just to give you a little model of something that we moved into when COVID hit, which was to start doing virtual workshops, which we had started 5 years maybe before COVID hit, was offering workshops online, on via Zoom and other video sharing conferencing software. But I was working at the time when COVID hit with a national group that supports nurses, and home health nurses who visit their clients' homes on a weekly basis. And all of their clients were mostly mothers, first-time mothers, so either pregnant or with a baby, an infant, up until age 2. So supporting them in becoming mothers. And so these nurses were taking on a lot. So all of these mothers are living with significant risk factors. Most common is living in poverty and all the things that intersect with that. So violence in the home, very high, housing insecurity, very high, food insecurity, very high, lack of education, formal education on the part of many of their clients. So these nurses are really, and high substance abuse, all those things. these nurses were showing up at these homes that oftentimes were unsafe even for them, and being nurses and being social workers and being friends and being mentors, all of these things, therapists, kind of all rolled into one job. The impact on them was great, and the impact of the pandemic on them was great in that they couldn't do home health visits anymore, and they were used to holding babies. They were used to sitting next to these moms and holding the moms in many ways, and teaching the moms how to mother their babies, and they were unable to do so. So as hard as that practice was before COVID, and we were doing work with them and having them talk through what they were living through and doing that work, and the impact of the multiple levels of trauma that were then becoming, for many of them, vicarious trauma or relational trauma. When the pandemic hit, it was kind of a different kind of trauma because they couldn't actually be there in the same way that they knew they wanted to be and needed to be. So we shifted our workshop model, of course, from being these intense 3-day long workshops. We began offering these virtual workshops that were 6 weeks long to make a digital story. And the other option that they asked us to do is that many of these nurses just didn't have time to do a 6-week-long workshop. They just didn't. Or they did, but they also wanted another option, a shorter option. So I developed a series of hour and 15-minute, hour-long reflective writing and story sharing workshops. I'm just going to kind of roll you through how those ran. So they were held on different days and different times so that nurses from across the country could log in. And they were supported institutionally, by their organization, the Nurse Family Partnership, to do this. They didn't need to take time off from their jobs to participate in any of this work. They were encouraged to do it, and it was actually funded out of their wellness and nurse retention initiatives because they were seeing so many nurses burn out before COVID. And certainly during COVID, massive amounts of burnout, massive amounts of that vicarious and relational trauma or secondary trauma. So I'm going to try and share the screen now so I can show you a little bit about what these look like. Hopefully you can see that. So we did have a couple slides. I don't usually like to use slides, but in a presentation like this to you all, I thought it would be helpful. So each week we would have a 1-hour session where nurses from across the country could log in. And there was a short description on the flyers that we would send out to the nurses. And they have upwards of 2,000 to 3,000 nurses across the country. So at any given session, there might be 5 nurses and there might be 30 nurses. And we got varying degrees of that. So I wanted to create a way of running these workshops that was scalable with those differing numbers. So we would always, I'm going to skip right past this slide, but this is exactly how I'd kind of run the workshop. We would start with breathing and a reading. So we'd have a centering exercise that included a reading. Usually that was a poem that I would choose. We would breathe for about a minute, intentional deep breathing, or at least invite people into that space to separate this from the rest of their practice for the day of being on their phones, video phones with these mothers and their young infants. And we would breathe, and then I would encourage people to continue that breathing, of course, otherwise they'd be dead. But to encourage the breathing and the closing of the eyes, and just like really taking one out, making a delineation between the rest of the day and this practice we were about to enter. And then I would introduce that reading and begin reading. we'd come back and have some introductions, and maybe that introduction would have something to do with the theme for the day. So each of these exercises, these kind of modules, would have a theme. And I'll get into that in a second. So that first poem, for example, is called Wild Geese. And the focus of this session, this 1 hour and 15-minute session, was on forgiveness, for example. We do some kind of introductions where people just quickly introduce themselves, but then also gave some information, whether it was a short story about their name, or we would sometimes play color bingo, and I would say, grab anything orange that's around you and tell a story about it, about where you got it, or what you use it for, or when you need it, or all kinds of things. So we would do color bingo, or something a little silly to kind of ease into the storytelling. Sometimes more serious storytelling, reflective storytelling that was going on. Then we would watch a story from our archives, and sometimes those would be made by ones that were made by nurses, some by other nurses. And what I mean by watch a story is mostly in our workshops, people make these short movies called digital stories out of the written story that they eventually land on, or that lands on them. You can watch some of those at another time if you want to go to nursestory.org to watch nursing stories specific, or storycenter.org to watch all kinds of other digital stories. You can see that. That wasn't the output of these smaller workshops. In any case, we would watch one of those stories that, again, had something to do with the theme of this module, which again, for this one, as an example, I said was forgiveness. And then that would lead us into a writing prompt. So here's an example of the story that I would show, press play and show it. And then we would get to the prompt. So these prompts were all designed to do at least one of two things. And one was to lead people into, they could choose to answer these prompts, and they're all designed to do one of these two things. And the two things would be, one, either go deeper into one's own work in the world right now and their experience living and working and caring for these moms and babies during COVID. And so maybe what you could either do that and take this prompt to explore your current lived experience and what was really going on for you and how were you handling it or not handling it. Or they were also used as could be used as an escape from the current moment. Because I think people really needed a chance to escape as well. So a chance to process, and a chance also to escape, which a lot of us had a hard time doing during COVID, of escaping. We couldn't go anywhere. And you know the drill. So all of these prompts were designed for those two things. I would then give people 15 minutes to turn off their Zoom camera, go write, and come back. And this is the part where we get back into that idea of the story circle. So because we only had limited amounts of time, we certainly didn't have time like we do in our in-person workshops, or even our 6-week workshops, where everybody gets a chance to share with the entire group where they're at and give feedback or receive feedback on their story. So I did something else instead. And what I did was use the breakout rooms feature of Zoom to put everyone in the workshop into a breakout room of 2 people. And so again, these nurses didn't know each other. So you're in a breakout room with a stranger. And I gave people around, I think it was 6 minutes total. So these were short pieces of writing that they did in their 15 minutes. So not a long time to read it. So what I wanted each person to do, and I think it's on the next slide here, about these story circles, was for the person to go first, one person to go first, to read their story to the other person, for that person to listen deeply and respond with one appreciation, one true appreciation, like something that they really loved and something that they were curious about with regards to the story. And then they didn't need to answer that question at that time. In fact, there wasn't time to answer it, but they were just left with a question or a curiosity that someone had about their story. And then they switched places. And I would shoot a little message to them through Zoom to let them know it was time to switch places and to then for the other person to share their story and have it held. I want to, and it was profound. They would then come back to the group. One or two of the people, if we had time, would then share their story out to the larger group. I would ask people just to write in the chat one word about how that felt, how that experience felt. And so people would do that. And then they did have the opportunity at the end of the session to send their written script to us along with a picture, and we would turn it into a story, a digital story for them or with them, or they could have it published out, their picture and their written story on a page that we created for them. So if they did want to actually kind of produce something that was public out of this workshop, they could. But the piece that was profound to me is that, again, normally in these workshops, we had time for everyone in previous workshops to share their ideas. In these workshops where I put two strangers together into a room, I found it to be incredibly profound. And what was profound about it was the pressure, in a way, that there was on each person to listen. I guess that's not an eloquent way of putting it. It's the honor that people felt for being perhaps the only person in the entire world listening to this person tell their story or share their story, and that they were sharing it with a stranger, a relative stranger. When we're in large groups, I think sometimes when we know that someone is going to be sharing something and that this group, our group, is supposed to respond, you might say to yourself, well, if your mind starts to wander, well, that's okay, because someone else will have something to say, I'm sure. So I won't necessarily be called upon, and I can let my mind wander or check my email or do whatever. When you know that you're the only person in the world listening to someone and having the charge to hold someone else's story, I think that responsibility and privilege becomes a very rich one. And so I felt that people paid a whole lot of attention to each other because of this great privilege or responsibility that they had to listen to one another and to respond with just an appreciation, a sincere gratitude, and a curiosity or question. And so that is how these workshops ran. And you can see some of these stories or read them by going to nursestory.org. And if you look at projects, there's one called Voices on the Frontline. I can bring up the web page here. And it looks a little something like this. Let me go ahead and share the screen so that you can see it. So these are the videos that were then made out of people's stories that we actually put together for them. These are all one picture stories with their voice. And then there are also written stories down below that aren't movies. So we have a lot of these that you can click on and read the story and see the picture that they chose to put with it. So again, that's at nursestory.org in the project gallery, right up here, projects and Frontline Voices, or Voices on the Front Lines. So I'm going to stop the share here and just say thank you for listening and for caring, and for whatever work you're doing that relates to this and relates to how we hold each other's stories and our own. If you have any questions for me, I can be reached at daniel@storycenter.org. Thanks so much.